I don't think I need to introduce most of the people, but still I will do it. We have Sally Painter from Blue Star Strategies, person who has spent a lot of time working in Central Eastern Europe, but also in the White House with Clinton administration, but the person who really understands the private sector in these countries, governments, and I think it will be very interesting to hear from you how you see these 30 years of economic transition and especially how you see the potential today. We have Jeffrey Sachs, Professor Sachs, who is now with the with Columbia University. Professor, you are the godfather of so-called shock therapy in many countries of Central Eastern Europe. You were at the very birth of this tremendous transformation that our countries went through in economy. So it's really a privilege to have you on this panel, but also I think very interesting to see how you see, when you look back at those years, the developments and where you see the whole region today and the opportunities. And then we have the new, young, fresh face, which I believe is a face of the future of the region. Marian Bocek is the CEO of IPM, which is, he will explain, but basically important investor in Central Eastern Europe, working and investing into new innovative technologies. And I think the kind of Central Eastern Europe, which is the future of this area. So maybe just to start, I think that 30 years have been really tremendous, and I can imagine that back in 1990, I would never think that I would be vice president of the European Investment Bank, which is the Bank of the European Union, being coming from this little Czechoslovakia, starting the huge process of transition, where still at that time everything was basically state-controlled. And I remember walking on the Wenceslas Square at those who know Prague. There is this Mustek party down, you know, Sally very well. And there was a guy who was one of the first entrepreneurs, and he was cleaning shoes. So he had actually a sign that I'm first entrepreneur in the Czech Republic, private entrepreneur, self-employed. He was cleaning, and people really liked that. There were always lines to experience what the private sector actually does. And then after about 3 or 4 months, he disappeared. And instead of him, there was a sign, I earned my first 1,000,000 crowns, I'm retiring. so that was a kind of first sign of this new wave of economy and life which was coming to the region. And for many of us, it was a tremendous change, which of course changed the lives of people, but also the region itself. Changed the region from the countries who were fully dependent on state economy, on ownership, and behind in terms of technologies, economy from the Western world, but today very much catching up, and in many cases being actually the source of innovation and new companies. And just when you look at some of the names which appeared as sponsors of this event, companies as Inobat, or Slovnaft, and others, these are all new faces of the region, and I think it's so important that they're also here with us today. So I would like to go now to the panelists. I asked each of them first to say a little about their own experience from the region, how they, when they look back, how they assess the development, the change, and what are maybe some of the lessons that you would draw from that. And maybe if we could start, Sally, with you, please.
Sure. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed the discussion so far, and I think the most fun is while I'm meeting new friends, it's so wonderful to see some old faces that we really have worked together in this area for 25 years. And I'm especially proud to have just recently joined the GlobeSec board. I think GlobeSec is doing very important work, and their work is even more important today, and I'd love to see them expand into other areas with the lessons learned from the 4 Visegrad countries to some countries to the east. I think there's an awful lot that we can learn from those experiences. Like many of you today, I was very active in the heady days when the Berlin Wall fell. There was so much energy, there was so much excitement, and we've seen how hard the countries have worked to transform themselves from the state-directed command economies to market-based. And I personally was very active working with the governments as we made history with Western integration, with NATO, EU, and most recently the OECD. One of the biggest lessons I've had from those times is that when we were working together, there was high hopes not only from the government, but the citizenry, the NGO community, and we were all in for Western integration. We had one goal, and everybody was on it. It was a clear mission. We were going to have Western integration, economic growth, political stability, and military security. As the panel description notes, there has been incredible progress since then. People have benefited tremendously from the reforms, but I think there's still more to be done. From an economic growth perspective, I've seen it firsthand because I helped probably a dozen companies come to the region. Although I was a small player in this field, I helped companies like General Motors, International Paper, Procter & Gamble come into the market, and we're very excited and we're thriving. But as I said, while so much change and development has been successful, the reality is that not everything has been done or perfect, I think is always the case. What are some of the challenges? I think decades of state control have not been swept away altogether. Vestiges of that era still linger and continue to manifest itself in challenges that hold the region back from really achieving its true potential. What are the problems? I think we all know them. It's entrenched corruption. It's the oligarchic power that we never predicted. It's government's role in the economy. There still needs to be reform. We need greater levels of transparency, judicial reform, enforcement, and we need accountability. And that's not to say that there isn't a positive role for government to play. I think history has taught us that for robust growth, government has to have policies that invest in their people and their core competencies. What is the next big it? Damon referred to our North Star idea. We really haven't found that yet. We know we want to work together on values, but really the next phase is how do we have this economic development really grow? And I think one of the next key elements for the governments is that they need to invest in their education, in the healthcare, in higher learning, and in workforce training. And all four countries really are lagging behind sort of the indicators in that area. That's why companies come. Each of these areas help ensure dynamic workforces, flexible labor markets, and those are critical to sustaining growth and attracting investment. The basic factors that make for successful economies are where people and business can thrive and grow. And the key instruments to make an investor feel good is that their money is safe and they're confident that there's a level playing field where everybody will be treated equally under the law. When it comes to the question of specific growth sectors for the region, I think there's a much more challenging answer. We're asked on this panel to talk about innovation. Is that a natural fit? Possibly, but I think there are other natural fits too, and we don't need to confine ourselves just to that. What is the next big idea? You know, 5 years ago, it was everybody wanted to be an IT hub. Now we're talking about innovation. We're talking about resilience. Those are the kinds of topics. Whenever I think about what a country needs to do to develop their unique assets or attributes, I always like to go back to Finland. In the mid-50s, Finland, which was not a vibrant economy, decided that they were going to build and create the greatest conductors of symphonies in the world. And if you look around today, the investments that they have made in education, in music, almost all of them studied in Finland at some point. They sort of have the market, and they did something different and unique. And I think we need to look at each country individually to see what that might be. Whatever focus areas are pursued, the government needs to be very clear-headed on what that best asset is and what that value is. When I think back about how these companies came early on, first of all, they loved America. They wanted American investment. The governments from both the central government and the local governments were working together with a common mission. Today, it's different. I've had some of my greatest successes in this part of the world, and I've also had some of my biggest failures. Why have we failed? Why did a major entertainment company not come in? Central government and the local government couldn't agree. Sometimes it was a political party issue. It was a turf issue. An energy company that I was trying to bring into this region, the government didn't want to open up the license to foreign investors. They said, we need to keep the energy in the ground. I said, well, if you don't know how much energy is in the ground, you don't know how much security you have. You need to understand it. We used to be the country that everybody wanted to come. Now we're competing with China. And China is beating our socks. It's not America first anymore, and we need to get that back as well. I also think back to the times when we were coming in and there was a really different corporate culture. Americans have a tendency to shoot first and ask later, but it's a real entrepreneurial spirit and they'll take risk. For the first 10 years, we were really working on how do we get people to make decisions. No one's going to tell you what to do. You have to lead and be entrepreneurial. And I'm pretty confident that this new generation is going to do it. But we do have to explain to them how much work we did to get here. Honestly, I think to look at the opportunities for a more positive growth trajectory, a good place to start is to go back to what made us successful in those early heady days. And much of that success was based on our attitude and approach of openness and engagement with partners and allies. And we are seeing a backtracking of that. The region's successful future should somehow be based on that openness model, similar to the engagement we endured in the first 25 years. Identifying shared values, whether in terms of investment, alliances, or cultural exchange, we can't demonize change or different people. As opposed to focusing on trading on areas of divisiveness and differences, I think we need to think about what we can do and work together. I really believe it's the time for us to work with our allies, to work with NATO, to work with the EU on military cooperation, cooperation of economics and trade, and I really believe in the V4. I know we're going through a very difficult time, but the idea that 4 countries got together with a common mission is something that I'm not ready to give up. And I really would love to work with GlobeSec and all of you to figure out how we can strengthen and get the vision back on forth for the V4. Each of the countries has dealt with the changes of the economy in different ways. Some of them have dealt with it by calling it the blame game, blaming others. I think that that's wrong-headed, and I don't think it will be effective in the long run. Looking for a scapegoat isn't going to solve anything, but I do believe each country has a real opportunity to evaluate their best assets and put together a plan that is unique to them, but that we can also work together on. So I would love to work with all of you on these kinds of topics and share our experiences.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I fully agree. I think that today Central Eastern Europe is at the phase when we are looking for this new model of economic growth. Because until now, the economic developments and very fast economic growth was mostly driven by foreign direct investment, which was based on cheap labor force and opening up of the new markets. Of course, this is now more or less exhausted. And the question is, what is going to drive the economic development in the future? I think the general answer is that this is the innovation and new technologies. But then the question is, how does, as you mentioned, Sally, how does the region utilize its potential? And it has to be based on education. It has to be based on the openness of the economy and the transparent treatment of investors. So all these are issues. But I would like to turn to Jeffrey. You have been with the transformation in Central Eastern Europe since the very beginning, in Poland with Mazowiecki's government, with Finance Minister Balcerowicz, and the first reformists of the region, then also in Russia with Gaidar and the first group of Russian reformers. The shock therapy was and still is very heavily discussed with all pros and cons, but in any case, it did, especially in Polish case, create the base for Poland to grow and to become one of the leaders of Europe and even globally. And now we deal mostly with environmental sustainable development issues. So in a way, I think you have made this, even you professionally, this journey, as many of these countries are doing themselves, looking much more at sustainable development, climate issues, and so on. So if you could maybe share with us how you see this transformation phase and what are the lessons for you?
Thank you very much. Well, this is a fun year for me in looking back because it's the 30th anniversary and it's almost unimaginable, the change, except that it is just as it was supposed to happen, I would say. What has happened we thought it was going to be Czechoslovakia, but it turned out to be Czech Republic and Slovakia, which is fine. And Poland in particular, things worked. They worked in a very historic way. And it's fun also a little bit for me to remember the drama of those days, and I just wanted to share a couple of stories with you. I first got involved the day the roundtable agreement was signed in Poland, but I was invited 3 months before that in January 1989 by a Polish official who asked me to come to look at the debt crisis in Poland. And I said that I would love to, but Lech Wałęsa was under arrest, and I couldn't really work with his government, with this gentleman's government. But if they ever freed Lech Wałęsa, please give me a call. And such was 1989 that he called back four weeks later and said, we're about to end martial law, now would you come? So that was a pretty good result. And I showed up on April 4th. The crisis was very severe, and the political drama was absolutely revolutionary. On June 4th, of course, were the elections in Poland at the same time as Tiananmen Square, halfway around the world, so it was quite a day. And after June 4th, I was very much involved in the tactical response to an overwhelming election for solidarity, what to do, because nobody knew what to do. If you tried to form a government with the Soviets, put the troops back in, what would happen? Would martial law be declared again, and so forth? One thing that was amazing that people should know and probably don't know is that the brilliant move of a coalition government in July 1989 was midwifed in part by Gorbachev, who told Jaruzelski, it's time to put the Solidarity people into government. And on the Solidarity side, Adam Michnik, who's one of the great heroes of our time, had the idea that you keep the presidency, the communists, we'll take the prime ministership. And that's how Poland made its move to democracy. And at the lunch, when he explained to me that strategy over his kitchen table in July 1989, as this was unfolding, I asked Adam Michnik, when will this happen in Czechoslovakia? And he looked at me with a straight face and said, this fall. And I said, because it was so direct, I said, how do you know? And he said, because Havel and I planned it this weekend, this past weekend. We were together in the Tatras. And he called it exactly how things were going to go. But to give you a sense of the mystery of the world, I got involved. I wrote the first reform program for Solidarity in an all-nighter, one night in July '89. The U.S. government was extremely helpful at that time, something that is unimaginable today, unfortunately. But it was understood that this was a revolution that the United States had to support. And so I made many recommendations for debt cancellation and for currency stabilization funding and so forth, all of which were accepted by the White House, with Brent Scowcroft, General Scowcroft, and Bob Dole, Senator Dole, playing a very important role in all of that. The reforms were developed in the fall of '89, and during that time we went to my wife Sonia's, who's here, to her hometown, Prague, and we spent a weekend in Prague on my birthday in November '89, and I was asked by two economists to come meet with them to discuss Poland's reforms. So I went to a gray building and inside, and they led me to a back room, and we talked in a very, very hushed voice for an hour, and I explained what the Polish reform was and how it was going to work and so on. It was a little bit tense, and they were very nervous. At the end of it, I said, "When is it going to happen here?" And they said, no way, impossible." I said, "Oh, are you sure?" No. So we agreed that I would come back next spring for a conference that they were organizing. And we went from there to Belgrade, where I was meeting with Prime Minister Ante Markovic. And we turned on the television a few days later. First, the wall came down. And then a few days after that, we're watching Wenceslas Square on live television. That's the guy that I met. And of course, it was Václav Klaus and Vladimir Dlouhý, who had told me a week before, nothing's going to happen here. So they missed the whole revolution almost. But that's how fast things were moving. But let me now jump forward the 30 years. The idea of all of the economic reforms and what became called shock therapy, my idea was immediate currency convertibility and openness to trade, because the whole theory of the reforms is if you integrate the economies, then you have a convergence in economic development. Lower wages, skilled people, factories that can be retooled, you will have economic growth. And the numbers worked out almost as not quite as optimistic as I was, but almost precisely as one would expect from convergence. Basically, Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic Poland was about 1/3 of the income level of Germany in 1989. Now it's 2/3. So it doubled the proportion. Czech Republic and Slovakia, a little bit richer at the time, and also roughly doubling. So it's not complete convergence over the course of 30 years, but it is going from 35 to 70% of the income level of Germany. That is a phenomenal success story. Democracy, open societies, and a tremendous period of economic convergence. It works. What's my biggest disappointment? That we didn't understand that what happened in those countries, the support that the United States gave needed to be given also to the former Soviet Union. Because what happened, instead of creating an open, integrated economic space, as Gorbachev believed, we moved NATO boundaries 1,000 miles to the east and created a new division rather than ending the divisions. So to my mind, we made a very bad mistake. I was very frustrated with the Clinton administration, I have to say, in the early years, because there was no help for Russia that was meaningful. And in the end, the Russian reforms failed through the internal chaos, the massive corruption, and the complete lack of Western support. We just couldn't get our heads around the idea that the kind of help that we gave strategically and tactically to Central Europe could have made a very big difference further to the east. And so in a way, we lost a historic opportunity. Maybe we'll recover it, I hope. But the new divisions that happened, in my opinion, were historically unnecessary and to this day remain very dangerous. And I can tell you, the things that I recommended in Poland that the White House supported within 8 hours in 1989 were the same things that I recommended for Russia that were all rejected by the White House. And I know the difference now. I didn't understand it then, but it was a geopolitical perception that Russia's on the other side. That's not our business. We're not out to restore Russia's strength. That's the other side of the divide. And I think it was a historic misjudgment, actually, and a mismanagement of, or lack of foreign policy that was very effective. Where are we today for these countries? Well, basically, there is no more, in my opinion, no more transition in Czech Republic or Slovakia or Poland. These are just normal European economies. They're not as rich as Western Europe, but the gap continues to narrow. But to be rich in this world, you have to be innovative. You don't just follow. You don't only take investment from outside. You have to make your own way. If you want to have an income not of $35,000 per capita, but of $50,000 per capita, you have to create a lot of technology yourself. This is the time for innovation. What kind of innovation is needed? Sustainable technologies. Because the great drama of the world actually is to escape from the self-inflicted wounds of climate change and environmental disaster. And that's really the most important kinds of investment. What's key for Central Europe, by the way, is the survival of the automobile industry as electric vehicles in the future. This is absolutely essential. Central Europe lives on the auto industry, and the internal combustion age is over. Within 10 years, 11 years, I say, in the year 2030, there won't be any more internal combustion engine light-duty vehicles sold, I believe. It'll all be electric or fuel cell or something else. Now the companies are starting to get it. And Daimler-Benz, Volkswagen, you should just make sure that they really move fast right now. Because Slovakia, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Poland, all depend on Germany making the right choices right now. And if Germany were to drag its feet, this would be a disaster for Germany and for all of Central Europe. So this is, to my mind, the single most important thing that's needed is to move to sustainable technologies. The region makes the world's best internal combustion engines. Vehicles, it has to make the world's best electric vehicles in the future. They have to be the most fun to drive. They have to be the best engineered. And this is the most important single challenge facing the region. Two other quick points. We need a very strong Europe because Europe is now in between a weird United States and the challenges of China and elsewhere. We don't have a transatlantic alliance the same way, especially with Trump. We have a bit of a nut as president and a lot of instability. And so Europe has to have its own position now. I'm very encouraged by the new commission. I believe that EIB has a huge role to play. I love the idea of a European Sustainable Investment Plan that should be a major effort for complete retooling of Europe in renewable energy, fast rail, electric vehicles, all the things that are needed. And Europe will then be a global leader in highly competitive industries in these areas. So this is really necessary. All of the sniping at Brussels by Poland or by Hungary in particular is ridiculous, obviously, self-defeating and dangerous to a point. So these games really have to stop. This is just internal political games in these countries, and it's quite dangerous to weaken Europe at this moment. Europe has to deal with China, and you cannot do that divided. 16 with China, the other side against. This is terrible. So Europe needs its own foreign policy, and it needs to be strongly united. And the second thing is that Europe absolutely has to find a way to reestablish economic relations with Russia, and for Ukraine not to get caught in the pincers between Russia and the EU, which is what's happened. It's literally divided down the middle. And this is dangerous for Europe, horrible for Ukraine, and it didn't have to go this way. It was a mistake, and Europe can find its way back. If Russia were an economic counterpart, this would be good for the European economy, very good for Russia, and good for peace. And it's possible to find the path back to that. So all in all, I think it's been a great 30 years from the point of view of Central Europe. Things have worked, but I wish it had been for all of Europe, not only for Central Europe, but also for European Russia as well, that we hadn't created the new divisions, and it's never too late to get it right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, and also for sharing with us some of these unknown parts of the story, which I never heard about, what you mentioned in terms of revolutions and changes. And really would like to use this opportunity to thank you for your personal contribution to the reforms in our countries, because without people like you, I think we wouldn't have achieved what we did achieve. So thank you so much, and also for your persistence. I think on the 2 points, I agree that probably much more could have been done in the neighborhoods, whether eastern or southern, because we should not forget about Balkans as well. Unfortunately, this is one area where I am disappointed with the European politics. When you look at Balkans, you see that actually it's much more and more dominated by China, Turkey, Russia. I mean, Europe is basically losing it. Not even talking about the United States, which is...
It's not even the neighborhood.
It's Europe. These are all, of course, countries which would like to be part of European Union, etc. But I don't think there is a sustained interest and enough attention to this. We are too much, unfortunately, embroiled in our own domestic petty politics inside the EU. And the second thing on a strong European Union, I fully agree. I think that this is really the time to be strong, to have our own position. Of course, it has to be supported by strong economy. And what you mentioned about the transition in terms of climate change, economic transition in terms of, for example, e-mobility, the car industry, which is undergoing huge changes. This is exactly what we need to do. And as you mentioned, European Investment Bank, we actually adopted recently a strategy to transform ourselves into so-called climate bank of the European Union, which for us means that currently we invest around 20% each year of our budget, of our lending, which is around 17 or 18 billion euro. And by 2025, we would like to have 50%, so around 40 billion euro for the climate-related projects. So we believe this is a contribution to where Europe should go. But this brings me to the third panelist, because this is exactly what Marian and his team have been doing, which is how to bring innovation and support innovative industries in Central Eastern Europe. So, Marian, maybe also from your perspective, maybe less about the past, but more about now and future.
Thank you, Vasil. Actually, I would like to talk about the past a bit, if I may. It's a great honor to be in the company of you, Vasil, Jeffrey, and Sally. Actually, the fact that I get to sit here confirms that the shock therapy and the clinical economics theory has really worked in Eastern Europe. Because in '89, I was a 7-year-old boy living in a village close to Polish borders. There were more cows than people, and my dad wanted me to become a doctor, in a state hospital, because that was the greatest thing to do at the time. And I was very lucky that I was part of the cohort of millennials, the lucky generation that I was able to travel. In '99, I got to the U.S. On a high school on a tennis scholarship. Did my high school in Ohio. Went to college where I studied econ. I had the opportunity to study on Wall Street. The Lehman Brothers. So saw the heyday of Wall Street, also the doomsday. Then I got to do good things at the World Bank for Central and Eastern Europe, but also African, Latin American countries on the infrastructure side. And then I realized, actually, I remember I had this kind of an epiphany moment in 2002 when Slovakia won the World Cup in hockey in Gothenburg, and this was the greatest accomplishment of our young nation. We beat Russians in the final 4-3. In the semis, we beat Canadians, and at the time I was a college sophomore at Oberlin, and I was screaming to everyone, so Maestri Sveta. None of the Americans could understand what was going on, but at the time I was thinking, I really would like to do this one day, to go home and set up a company in Bratislava that could put together a World Cup winning team and having an impact. I was lucky enough that, after 17 years abroad, I came back to Bratislava. We set up an investment company called IPM, and started just recruiting a lot of the smart Slovaks who were frustrated sitting in London or New York or in Asia, reading the local newspapers online about what's happening in Slovakia, and kind of dreaming to come back, but didn't know how to return. They were looking for that gateway to go back, and they. You don't want to do investment banking in New York City or London and pull all-nighters, once a week unless you really have to. And so we were able to recruit in Bratislava a lot of young talented kids. The last 5 years, the company was set up in 2014. We actually just had our 5th year anniversary, and we started putting together kind of a varsity team where. Bratislava became the nucleus. It became kind of our, I call it's an Omaha, Nebraska of Europe, because by being in Bratislava, we were able to escape the cognitive prison of the big financial centers, New York, London. We were truly independent in our thinking, in the way we're looking at things, and I was very lucky that the team has grown from Bratislava. We opened San Francisco office. We opened London office, Seoul, Korea, Hong Kong. We now manage more than $1 billion. We've done close to 13 investments, many of them in the U.S. In asset class that we have invented that we call infra tech, which is an idea where you make a venture investment in a Silicon Valley company and then you turn it into an infrastructure project by bringing the technology to Slovakia, and I'll get to talk about it. But what I'm trying to get at is that actually we're able to do this, and we became the fastest growing asset manager in Europe, not despite being in Slovakia, but thanks to being in Slovakia. And it's this amazing phenomena that we've seen in Slovakia, and it's the fact that the region has gone through so much hardship. We've got Nazis at our, back door, communists, which really impose such destruction of social values. But innovation throughout this time was kind of a way how to get out of this hardship. When people talk about the flying car technology coming out of Slovakia, the reason why it was actually created was because people were standing at the Danube. And in '89, they were thinking like, how do we get, or '88, how do we get to the, other side of Danube, to the other side of the Iron Curtain? And they thought of flying car would be fantastic. We could fly over the river and we can be on the right side of history, And on top of that, the region always had a strong history and innovation. I mean, we're a nation of inventors. You may not know this, but you know, the first parachute was invented by a Slovakian guy. You know, the father of thermodynamics comes from Liptovský Mikuláš, a small town, you know, close to the area where I was from, and you know, he was a professor of Albert Einstein, and you know, so you have all this kind of legacy that reverberated, and on top of it, you have an incredible, I call it hockey team mentality. You know, Slovaks, and I think all Eastern Europeans, you know, at least in kind of the Danube Valley region where we operate, you know, they're amazing when they get excited about something. You know, they create this force of nature. They get together, and this is why, you know, Slovakia, when you look at it historically, always beats the U.S. at the World Cup in hockey. You know, it's amazing. We lose to all the small nations, but we get to get together and really, you know, as a David take on the Goliath. You know, the David and Goliath story has been really powerful in our modern history, and for the first time, we're seeing that actually Eastern Europe is not justifying its existence. You know, we're actually making an impact in Europe, and you know, we went from the region that has been called the black hole of Europe by Madeleine Albright, and you know, we honor her obviously, and she's entitled to her opinion. But the region now moved into such a big innovation hub where, you know, we are the biggest car manufacturer per capita in the world. We have the largest concentration of automation and robots per employees in Central and Eastern Europe. And you know, we're building projects like InnoBat, which is one of our portfolio companies that has invested in R&D companies in San Diego, which have the most advanced high throughput technology in battery materials. And we're bringing this sophisticated technology into Slovakia, and we're converting it into a production plant that will actually develop customized batteries for OEMs. And Slovakia happens to have 9 out of 18 OEMs in the region there. So it's an incredible manufacturing base, and it's an incredible opportunity for a San Diego-based company to actually increase their margins, to actually move from just R&D into production and become a battery production company, which addresses Europe's existential problem. And I would like to pick up on what Jeffrey said. European civilization is at a crossroads. We have fallen behind 10, 20 years behind the Chinese. It's incredible where, you know, you look at the switch to e-mobility, and it's there, it's going to happen. There's no alternative to it, we know it. But actually Europe doesn't have a single battery producer with a European IP that is actually producing batteries for EVs. It's all you know, coming from China. The Chinese battery production is 3 times the size of the production of the U.S. and Europe combined. You know, it's a technological sovereignty crisis that Europe is facing right now, and it's incredible that we're seeing this paradigm shift where, you know, we went from the days where the European IP was being converted into production in China. Now actually the Chinese technology is being assembled and manufactured in Europe. You know, so a very big risk of Europe becoming you know, obsolete in terms of technological advancement. And I'm glad to say that actually the 2 biggest areas that have been identified by Brussels as the core areas of focus are the battery project and human brain project, basically boosting Europe's capability to be able to actually compete with the Chinese when it comes to quantum computing, you know, to actually have their own European semiconductor chip base. And I'm glad that IPM is now founding 2 companies that are really solving the problem, and with the underlying knowledge and the founders coming from Silicon Valley. One is InnoBat for batteries, I mentioned, and the other one is Techhume, where the founder sits in California, and he happens to be Slovak American. And you know, this is a guy that people don't know about, but this is a man who built the GPU chip for PlayStation 2. He built a chip for Tianhe, the world's super fastest computer in the world, which happens to be Chinese. And now he's building the chip that will be able to address the biggest problem we have right now, is the energy consumption of data centers. You know, which if you combine the data centers of Google, LinkedIn, Facebook combined, they actually burn more electricity than is the UK consumption per year. So, you know, we have Central Eastern European projects and founders that are actually solving Europe's biggest existential problems, and I'm very proud of that. That you know, we're finally putting the region on the map and becoming relevant. And I would conclude it by saying that actually, paradoxically, if it wasn't for the Chinese and the trade wars between America and China, Europe wouldn't be this galvanized. I think we're seeing kind of a new unification project in Europe where the European Commission is creating schemes, investment programs led by the European Investment Bank to really put billions of dollars of capital to support these initiatives so that Europe can become relevant and competitive again. Thank you.
I think it's a fascinating story, and looking at your, Marian, your personal story in terms of how you moved from this little place in Slovakia, as you said, more cows than people, to the United States, and then bringing this knowledge and experience back to Central Eastern Europe and creating this Danube Innovation Valley, but also how when Europe and United States work together, how they can create new value, and now with the investments actually in Silicon Valley, and then applying the new technologies for the production in Central Eastern Europe. I think this is exactly where Europe and United States should be, because we can benefit, and when we work together, we really create new value and can move much faster, and we can deal with such challenges as China, disruptive technologies, and so on. But we are where we are, and Sally, I want to ask you, based on your experience in state administration, in the White House, in private sector, and looking at today's situation, where do you see potential in terms of transatlantic relations, in particular in private sector development, in trade? What do we think? And what do such organizations as GlobSec and ourselves? I think we are all here because we believe that this transatlantic link has a value and should continue, despite different political changes. So, what would you suggest? How should we proceed?
Well, I think on the trade front, we're in pretty bad shape. You know, 80% of global trade is between the U.S., EU, and China, and so when we're fighting, this is creating a global crisis. You couple that with the challenges with Boeing and Airbus, the dispute, and what's going to happen there. If we're going to have tariffs with auto, you're going to have to respond. You know, I was working on something called TTIP for years, and we actually thought we might do it, and it's dead. So I don't see a lot of bright lights on the horizon. I mean, we've got the 3 Cs initiative, which is good. We need more private sector energy behind it. It can't be driven by governments. LNG exports are up, and that's good because it lessens the dependency on Russia. But you know, in the White House is a person who does not have a strategy for trade. He is boxing, and he doesn't have an end game. And so I don't see, until somebody changes, I don't see how we're going to get out of this.
Not very optimistic. I hope that things will change some way. I'm actually going to be at the 3 Cs Initiative Summit in Warsaw this week on 26. I think it's a very interesting initiative, and also a way, because one of the problems in our part of Europe is that there is not enough north-south connectivity. So different kind of infrastructure in terms of transport, energy, but also digital infrastructure, especially in the north-south dimension, is very, very, very important. So also European Investment Bank is engaged. But I think on this issue of transatlantic, I think what Maria mentioned is also one of the ways forward, that we should use private sector as the drivers, that private sector can go beyond politics, beyond the current moods in White House or wherever, and really focus on pragmatic cooperation where this cooperation, transatlantic links, do make sense, and I do believe that this will help us. Jeffrey, turning to you, and you mentioned the issue of sustainable development. I know this is something that you are now very much focusing upon, and we know that climate change is one of the big global issues. We see the demonstration just outside of this place and throughout Europe, which I think is very important. And now we have also a global issue which kind of unites in a positive way people and goes beyond against this nationalization of politics. But how do you think that transatlantic relations can benefit from this, and also how such people and institutions like GlobSec could support, and anything that you want to share on this topic?
Okay, thanks. Well, you know, we're almost out of time to keep warming in anything resembling a safe range for the planet. We set the climate treaty in 1992 and then did almost nothing for the next 27 years. And even after signing the Paris Climate Agreement, getting a real turn in the world's energy system is still proving to be a very difficult task. The basics are very well understood, which is that we're already past the climate of the entire past 10,000 years. We're already in the midst of increasingly intense and frequent major disasters. The United States is experiencing climate losses of between $100 billion and $200 billion a year in major events. This is soaring with the extreme hurricanes, storms, floods, forest fires, and all the rest. And of course, the U.S. is not special in this. And we've already reached the temperature, or soon will reach the temperature, at which the ice sheets will have a high likelihood of partial disintegration and major sea level increase. Some scientists, including my colleagues, think that we're already at the temperature consistent with an 8-meter sea level rise once this unfolds in the coming century or so. So the message of science is very clear, which is that we have to decarbonize the energy system essentially as fast as possible, and practically speaking, that means by mid-century at the latest. And that has a fighting chance to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees C, but maybe not, maybe a 50-50 chance of doing that. This means that every major region of the world should have a plan for full decarbonization. And that means all electricity should be zero carbon. Transport needs to be decarbonized, and industry needs to be decarbonized. For power generation, this essentially means the shift to renewables, wind, solar, hydro, geothermal. For vehicles, as we mentioned, it means electric vehicles. For shipping and aviation, it's an open question of exactly which technological pathways are going to be the most promising, but it's urgent. And for industry, there are a number of difficult challenges. Europe is the leader in getting to zero, both because Europe has the good fortune of having relatively few fossil fuels, and so it's not doesn't face the internal politics of fossil fuel resistance. But everywhere where there are fossil fuels in Europe, there's resistance. So for most of Europe, it's not a big problem, but look at how Central Europe is torn up by small amounts of coal sector, and how hard it is to move politically in that context. Again, Mrs. van der Leyen has said within the first 100 days of the Commission, there will be a new climate act to get to climate neutrality by 2050. But more than a law, we need EIB and an investment plan and a technology strategy for how to do it. The massive buildup of a battery industry is a great thing. This is absolutely essential. Of course, the United States is right now, 75% of Americans are in favor of action. We have about 35 states that are taking decisive action, and we have a completely corrupted Republican Party and a completely, I won't use the adjective in polite company, President of the United States. This means that we can't act until he's gone and a new president comes in, which I hope will happen even before 2020, but at least January 20th, 2021, it better happen if this country's going to have a chance of getting out of this mess peacefully, internally. So we're in high stakes in this country. A lot of the drama about climate change is other regions of the world. China is really a decisive player. My thought about that is that Europe should challenge China, essentially. And EIB, I think, could play a huge role. China has the Belt and Road Initiative, and I think Europe should say to China, okay, we'll partner with you. We're going to have our European Sustainable Investment Plan. We will partner with BRI if it's clean and sustainable. And that means stopping the coal-fired power plants that you're building in Pakistan and Bangladesh, in other parts of Central and East Asia, and let's clean up Eurasia. And we'll do it together because Europe and China could cooperate on a Eurasian-wide infrastructure program that I think would be of decisive benefit for the world. And my theory is that China would be very receptive to that kind of offer. Of course, the United States is trying to pull Europe into this bizarre trade war with China. This is just simply the worst idea imaginable that Trump has, if you can call anything with Trump an idea. But it seems to be an idea of some sort, at least in idée fixe. Today he announced, you saw, well, we're not going to have a deal before 2020, and the stock market, like a line down that moment within 30 seconds. Because the markets understand that this is crazy, self-destructive policy by an absolutely mentally disordered man. And if we had a normal Congress, we would actually say, you can't do this. We should not be in a country with one person making a global trade war. But our Congress is paralyzed because the Republican Party is completely collapsed. It's in the hands of this man. So in any event, that's the sad part. For Europe, Europe should lead. Europe should be in the forefront of the sustainable technologies. Europe should partner with China, not be party to some crazy trade war. This is going to lead to prosperity and peace in Eurasia if Europe does this right.
Thank you. Actually, just one kind of promo for GlobSec, because on this issue of moving towards carbon neutral economy, which of course has its own price tag, and I think we saw in France that people have a reaction to this. So we are actually bringing in High Tatras for the so-called Tatra Summit in 3 weeks. We are bringing ministers of finance and economy from Central Eastern Europe with the heads of key utilities, petrochemicals, car manufacturers to discuss how we do it in a coordinated manner, how we move towards carbon neutral economy in a way which would also take into account interests of local people. Yeah.
I should just say one word about that. The usual answer by economists is not helpful. It says put on a carbon tax. But the problem with the carbon tax is that about 90% of the tax is for decisions made in the past, whereas we need to affect future decisions. So if you put on a carbon tax, people have vehicles that they're going to have for the next many years, and they've already chosen those vehicles. We need to make sure that the future vehicles that they buy are electric vehicles. We have power plants that are going to be thermal power plants until they're phased out. We need to make sure that all the new plants are clean energy. So my recommendation is you could say a marginal carbon tax on future decisions, not on past decisions. Don't punish people for the past, but say all the new power plants built have to be zero carbon. All the new vehicles, especially say after 2030, have to be zero carbon. Industry needs a roadmap for the next 20 years. Aviation, steel, cement need to create roadmaps. Just putting a price on carbon rather than a regulatory approach, I think is the wrong way because it leads to pain, but the gain is very, very gradual while the pain is very upfront. And that's politically the reverse of what we need. So if you could convey at least my thought at this point that what we need are clear regulatory guidelines that say you are going to phase out fossil fuels step by step on your future investment programs. And that doesn't create the immediate pain. And therefore, it makes it politically viable, in my view.
Thank you very much. We would love to invite you to this discussion as well, so you can convey this message directly to the policymakers and business leaders. Anyway, we came to the point where we should pretty soon, but maybe we have time for one question. If there is anybody who has one, please. Please.
You need yours. Yes. I'm Adrian Basoro. I was at the National Security Council as when you came as the economic person for Europe and Eurasia in 1989 when you came and sold us shock therapy. Thank you. But my question is partly about it, but especially the privatization aspect of the shock therapy, broadly understood. But my question is not only for you, Jeffrey, but also for Marian. It has to do with, it is about corruption. We've been congratulating ourselves on the success story of the economy, the economic story of the last 30 years, but one untold part of it so far is the degree of corruption. Money in politics, politicians distorting policies for money. I also would like to ask a new entrepreneur and innovator how it's working out now. I know you have a new president who is totally anti-corruption in Slovakia, and congratulations on that. But the environment until that was one of extreme corruption, as is the case in most of what we're talking about, Central and Eastern Europe. So please comment on corruption in the 30-year perspective and in the present. Thank you. By the way, I was also in Prague as ambassador to Czechoslovakia and Czech Republic after the Velvet Divorce and saw the beginnings of all this. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, privatization was a huge puzzle, I would say, and you know, and no one worked out a fully satisfactory model to this. In my first memos, I said this will take 5 or 10 years, and no one has a solution. I was not in favor of voucher privatization and other. I was not in favor of those tricks. And I was very concerned about corruption, and it's a long story, but my basic thoughts were how to corporatize the sector so that the assets weren't just stolen by the managers and all the rest in the interim of the transformation. So I spent a number of years, this plan, that plan, basically none of them made much headway or difference. The limits of corruption depended a lot on the political environment, both internally and externally, and also on the nature of the industry. Poland had relatively low levels of corruption compared to some of the other countries. Why? I think most importantly because the Pope was Polish. how much could you steal with your Pope there? So it was like having those big eyes on you. And Poland just kept better behavior. Czechoslovakia went for the voucher privatization. I was not crazy about that. Russia was a goddamn free-for-all after 1994. I quit in 93. I lasted 2 years, and the U.S. disappointed me so much, and Russia was not the easiest place in the world. In fact, it's the hardest place in the world I've ever worked. But you could see the massive corruption coming. But the United States did nothing, played along. And that was because somehow this idea that these oligarchs were going to get Yeltsin reelected in 1996 was a deal, which was absurd. And I tried with Summers and others, Larry, you got to stop this thing. This is out of control. And they wouldn't touch it. And so there was a lot of bad behavior by U.S. companies, and the administration, Clinton administration, wasn't helpful in this, and some idea that, well, let them steal things, but it'll build a new, class for private sector, which is a very bad idea and very naive idea. So what can I say? Stopping corruption is very difficult. In this period, the United States became a lot more corrupt ourselves because all of the safeguards against money in politics were eliminated by the Supreme Court of all places. And so we lost our ability to govern ourselves properly or to therefore have much useful influence outside. And outside depends a lot on politics. Of course, the Soviet Union did not have civil society, so there was no control from the streets for the first 15 years, basically, because civil society had been decapitated literally for a century. And in Central Europe, I think it was better in Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Slovenia than it was farther to the east. It got worse, and into the Soviet Union, the worst of all. But self-control is not easy. That's what corruption is. You need an independent judiciary, you need some traditions, you can't lock up people that you don't like, and you can't have creeps at the top stealing massive amounts. And it takes a big combination to get that to work properly. And nobody really figured that out optimally. I mean, for sure. It was just as, I kept being told, oh, don't you know, Jeff, the rule of law is very important. I said, yeah, I never thought of that. It's just, you don't want to start where you were in 1989. It was just not good to have thousands of companies without any control. But that's where it was. And there was no technical way to solve that problem because every technical way could be distorted. And so it required some kind of structure of the society, enough people going to church on Sunday, or the Pope watching you, or civil society like Solidarity was, after all, to say, stop that. In other places, there was just a lot of robbery. And then, I'm sorry, one more big point. It was obvious, I said it 1,000 times, it didn't matter at all. Don't privatize your oil, your gas, your nickel, your mining. Those are huge state assets that are essential for the government revenues, and they're the jewels of, I mean, they're the only things of value. In Russia, it was all gone in 2 years. Everything privatized, quote unquote, stolen, basically. There was no reason to privatize any of that from an economic point of view, because God forbid Gazprom remained a state-owned enterprise. It could have remained a state-owned enterprise, or any of the Norilsk or others. They didn't have to be grabbed the way they were. And so privatization should have been for the manufacturing companies, should have been for the shops, should have been for the flats, the apartment flats, and things like that. But for the giant primary resource enterprises, those could very well have remained in state hands. They would have been mismanaged, and there would have been stealing of income, but not stealing of the assets quite the same way. And but of course, that was where the big prize was. And once Chernomyrdin came in, once the U.S. turned away from caring about that, and anyway, once the U.S. wasn't doing anything to contribute, it was just in Russia's hands, and with a lot of U.S. crooks around, also trying to make a lot of money quickly, it was uncontrollable. That's why I didn't go back to Russia for 20, 25 years.
Well, corruption is the sad stigma for the region of the past, and you know, I don't want to engage into any moral kind of relativism discussion here. You know, it's important not to look at the region as a basket, because you know, each of the countries have made, I think, incredible headways in improving, you know, on this topic. When it comes to projects and investments in startups and venture investments, especially the ones investing in deep tech, hardware companies that are capital intensive, you know, you get into this Darwinian world, you know, where really it's about survival of the fittest, and there's no room for corruption, because if you really want to build a battery production company or a chip manufacturing company, you clearly need to go for sources of capital that, you know, come from Brussels, from the likes of SoftBank, you know, the investors that have very rigorous KYC requirements, and there, you know, any signs of corruption, any signs of weakness in corporate governance structure are heavily penalized, and the projects are not getting funded, you know. So thanks to the shock therapy, I'm going to go back to it, and the integration that the region has reached, and being now truly part of the Euro-Transatlantic and the European Union structures, the venture investments coming from the region are now, you know, getting funding from the likes of the European Investment Bank, from the Brussels, are successful candidates, you know, in the Horizons grant schemes, and I think, you know, the bigger problem when it comes to startups in the region is still this heavy bias, you know, the preference for Western as opposed to Eastern projects, the East and West divide, which is still very prevalent, and I think this is a much bigger challenge, you know, in the quest of Europe to really unify its efforts and rally behind the biggest projects, including the ones in our part of the world.
Thank you, Marian. I think that I would like to finish more on an optimistic note. And although corruption is an issue, we all know it, but actually when you look at today's economy, it decreases the opportunity for corruption. Because today's economy and really what drives the value are intangible assets. Corruption is very much based on tangible assets, where, as you said, you can grab oil, gas, company, something, you know, equipment. Intangible assets in terms of knowledge, know-how, new thinking, etc. It's very difficult to corrupt that, because it's about the thinking of people and their minds and their ability to innovate and look forward. So I think the space for corruption is much less. We see that people, and I think the election in Slovakia, the president shows that people get fed up and want to see the change, and I think this is a good thing for the region. And I hope that institutions like GlobSec will also help to move us in the direction which will decrease this kind of unpleasant issues. But overall, I think we all agree that the region made a huge progress. We are somewhere where 30 years ago, in terms of economy, we would never believe we would be. And would like to thank our panelists both for their personal contribution to this process and helping us in the region to be where we are, and having people like Marian who are the leaders of the future. And thank you all for being with us for this discussion, and thank you all for a wonderful time. Thanks a lot.